Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everyone today. Once again, this is Ted Pattison from Critical Path Training. And some of you might have been here for Tuesday for our advanced query talk. This talk I put a little bit more time into. It's kind of a talk I've been developing over a series of deliveries, and hopefully it's getting a little bit more mature. So what we're going to talk about in this next hour is going to be encapsulated in a bunch of files that you can take and do what you want with. Notice that there is a particular GitHub repository. Let me go back to the browser for 1 second. Let me go ahead and navigate to GitHub, and there is a Daily Reporter Pro. So that's the name of the sample application I'm going to be showing. And once again, on the slide you can see HTTPS and github.com Critical Path Training Daily Reporter Pro. Just to be sure, I'm going to go ahead and put this in the chat window and send it to everybody. But the idea is that the code I'm going to show you can come get, and also the slides that I'm going to be giving. Notice that if I go down here, Power BI Embedded version 2, there's a PPTX file that you can download and give this presentation to your family members. Or there's a PDF file. What's kind of neat about GitHub, if you click that, you actually get a server-side rendering of my slides. Okay, so just wanted to make sure everyone knows that they're all there and available. Now, we're going to start with Power BI Embedding Fundamentals. We're going to talk about the first version and try to clear up some confusion about this new version that we have. We're going to introduce premium capacities and talk about how they factor in. There's no way we can be successful at Power BI Embedding unless we also understand how to authenticate with Azure Active Directory. And we're going to start programming against the Power BI service to embed resources. And we're also going to be programming against the Power BI JavaScript API before we get to the end of the hour. Now, all of you know and love the Power BI service. So it's accessible through the browser at https app.powerbi.com. It's also accessible through your mobile apps if you've installed Power BI on your iPhone or Android or Windows 10 phone. And then what we'll see, it's also accessible to us developers through the Power BI Service API. And that's one of the big programming points that we need to really get good at, if we're going to master Power BI embedding. Now, just to clear up some confusion, historically there was another version of Power BI Embedded, Power BI Embedded V1. Now, this was introduced about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, and it was introduced as a Azure service that's created on demand. So one of the issues about this is that you had to have an Azure subscription, which some developers and organizations didn't have already. But the idea was once you create this service, you're able to create these workspace collections and then create workspaces inside them. Now, in this first model, how did Microsoft get paid? So the idea was if you use Power BI Embedded V1 and you embed a report, every time there's a report session, it basically would charge the customer who owned the service 5 cents. And you had something where when one user starts a session and basically just clicks on the things in your report slicers, you can go a whole hour with a single session. If you have another user that's hitting the F5 key and refreshing the browser, it keeps basically giving you more and more sessions. Now, the good points about this first version of Power BI Embedded, it eliminated the need for you to be able to reach people who did not have a Power BI license. Okay, so in effect, it was able to decouple user security from your app security. And what I mean by that is that you would create an application and you'd have whatever authentication scheme you wanted, whether you're keeping your users in a SQL database or some other commonly used identity provider. You could still basically factor your app in, and your app could talk to the service, so users didn't really have to be authenticated per se. Now, it opened up Power BI to creating commercial applications. So those are the good points. Now, let's go ahead and detail, what were some of the problematic points about the first version of Power BI. Well, it required developers and organizations to either acquire or get Azure subscriptions. There was no out-of-the-box UI experience to upload PBX files. So you take it for granted you can go to your personal workspace and App Workspace, upload a PBX file either through the browser or through Power BI Desktop. But over in this other world, we basically had to upload things with PowerShell scripts. Okay. Also, there was a separate API. So there was one API when I programmed against Power BI, and then another one when I programmed against the Azure duplication of what Power BI was already doing. Okay. Now, another problem was a lot of customers complained with the per report session. It was very hard for them to estimate their costs. Now, another problem is currently, as of today, it's deprecated, so you can't go ahead and use Power BI Embedded V1. For customers that were already using it, they had some way to kind of sunset it over time. Now, Power BI Embedded version 2, has the same great points as we had in version 1. In effect, it eliminates the need for every user you want to reach to have a Power BI license. So once again, it kind of decouples your application security and how you want to authenticate your users from the way that the app authenticates and gets to Power BI. Okay, it opens up Power BI to creating commercial applications. Now, what are some of the improvements? So all the embedding features are now available through the same Power BI Service API that you might have been using for the last 2 years. Now, also, since we're moving everything back into the Power BI service, we can now just use the standard UI techniques, the browser or Power BI desktop, to be able to publish our Power BI desktop project files, our PBIX files. Certainly it's still possible to automate uploading these, with a C# application or with PowerShell, but at least you're not required to do that. There's an out-of-the-box experience for companies that don't want to go down that road of maintaining scripts or custom applications. Okay, now also there's new pricing models with Power BI Premium, so you know exactly how much you're paying per month. You might say, oh my God, that's a heck of a lot of money, but at least you know exactly how much you'll be paying per month. Okay, now there's no need to create, manage, monitor any Azure services, so you're basically just kind of monitoring a Power BI environment. And the last thing I want to point out is that Power BI Embedded was really a term that got latched onto what we did in Azure. So now when you're using the term Power BI Embedded, it's very ambiguous and it means very different things to different people. So what I've started doing is just using the term embedding features in Power BI, instead of saying kind of the proper term Power BI Embedded. Just realize that there's confusion and a lot of ambiguity around that term. Okay, now the Power BI Service API, that's the thing that we need to be able to talk to get started with Power BI Embedding. Now the Power BI Service goes by a couple different names. Now, for the first 2 years, I used to call this thing the Power BI REST API, as did everybody else, because the only way to access it was by making direct REST calls into it. So as a programmer, you're using something like HTTP client and issuing direct REST calls yourself. However, what you'll see is that now there's a nice .NET assembly wrapper around it. So you can basically use the .NET assembly version, which abstracts away the REST API. Now, the other thing is you'll see the term Power BI API. So, unfortunately, Power BI Service API, Power BI REST API, Power BI API all really mean the same thing. I really like the term Power BI Service API because there's one other API we're about to look at, which is the JavaScript API. So if you just say the Power BI API, it's kind of vague, kind of inferring that there's not another one. Okay, so be with me and like the term Power BI Service API, even though it's not standardized yet. Together we can all standardize that term. Okay, now we're using the Power BI Service API. Once again, as always, it's been accessible by making direct REST calls against the service. However, now we have something new, and that's one of the things I'm going to demo, and that is there's a NuGet package you can add to your Visual Studio project to add this assembly. The assembly name is microsoft.powerbi.api.dll, and it's installed in a NuGet package of the same name. Now, calling the Power BI service requires that your application goes through an authentication process with Azure Active Directory. Now, what we want to see is the big picture. Before I get into the weeds, you're going to create this application, and I just happen to pick Visual Studio 2017 and ASP.NET MVC. Certainly lots of other architectures could be used to do the same thing. But the big picture is the user launches your application. So now I have an MVC application that's running probably up in Azure, in some type of a web app. And so the first thing my app needs to do is to call into Azure Active Directory and go through one of the authentication flows and get back an access token. Once your application has the access token, it can then use that access token to make calls into the Power BI service. Now, once you're able to call into the Power BI service, you're able to call in and get out data that's required for doing the embedding. So step number 4 is get the information we need to embed a report, pull it back from the service, into your app in the middle tier, and then push that same data back out behind the browser. Now, once you've done that, there's another API, which is the Power BI JavaScript API. This is JavaScript code that sits in the browser. You write code to interact with the JavaScript API. You can write it in either JavaScript or TypeScript. But the idea is that you will go through the steps to create an embedded object, and the API behind the scenes is going to create an iframe and basically do this magic trick where it pushes a security token inside of it, and that establishes a connection back. Now, what's very important is that you realize that your application plays the role of Jim Lang. Now, your obvious question is, who the hell is Jim Lang? Okay, I'm glad you asked. It turns out that Jim Lang was the original host of the dating game. Just to refresh your memories, the dating game would be you get a really good-looking eligible bachelor. You then get a set of eligible bachelorettes. Hey, she looks familiar. I think I knew her in high school. And the idea is that, let's go back here, your application is Jim Lang. You have connected the browser to the Power BI service, but you don't go on the date. You basically drop out of the picture. Okay, so that gets to be an important piece. Let's go over and kind of take a quick look. So let's go ahead and fire up this app right here. So here's my app. And so what this is going to do is give me the ability to see what reports I have in a particular app workspace. Okay, that's great. Let's say that I find a particular report and I click on it. So what happens is that report is now created inside of an iframe. Okay. And if I go ahead and I click this, well, now I've run more JavaScript code, I've gotten more data back about a different report, and I've embedded that inside there. Now, what's important to see is that once this session starts up and that user goes to the report and starts using things like slicers, nothing's going back through your application. This is basically just a direct connection, between the iframe and the Power BI service. That's what we're going to spend the whole hour talking about, how to get to this point. Okay, now let's differentiate between two different types of embedding and these terms that we'll hear, first-party embedding versus third-party embedding. If I create an application and I want to authenticate the current user, so Bob uses my application, so does Mary, so does Fred, so whoever the current user is, I authenticate the user to their own identity, and we basically create a connection using that user's access token. So your code accesses the Power BI service, as whoever the current user is. Embedding requires an Azure access token for that user. The user requires not only an Azure account, but that Azure account has to be configured to have a Power BI license. Possibly the free license under circumstances, but it will always work if it is a pro license. Okay. Your code then has access to whatever resources that user has access to. Now, what's going to be more common is third-party embedding. Third-party embedding, we can't authenticate the user because it will do no good. The user doesn't have either an Azure Active Directory account, and if he does, he certainly doesn't have a Power BI license. So what happens is we have to authenticate using a single master user account. So your code accesses the Power BI service, as this one user, no matter who the real user is. Embedding is going to use not the Azure Active Directory access token, but it generates a more restricted token known as an Embed Token. Okay, now the big point here is that users don't need Azure AD accounts, nor Power BI licenses, and your code then has access to whatever the master has access to. Now, just to finish up this first section right here. What scenarios do we use first-party embedding? Well, first of all, organizations where all the users have Power BI licenses. So these users can already get to the Power BI service through the browser. They can already use mobile applications to access what's in any workspace they have access to. So your development really has to go beyond and do something better than what you get from the out-of-the-box experience. So while there will be some first-party developing, a lot of times companies say, don't bother. Microsoft has supplied the entire user and experience I need. Now, with third-party, it's different because you're typically reaching users that will have no access to the Power BI service through the browser or through mobile apps. So nothing happens unless you build a development effort. Okay, so once you kind of see that, what you then have the ability is to build custom commercial applications which have their own custom identity providers. You store your users anywhere you want. They don't have to be in Azure Active Directory. And to some degree, the security that you use to talk to Power BI is completely decoupled from the security you use to authenticate your users. Okay, now your application can use your own custom identity provider, or you could use any of the many identity providers that are available on the internet. Now, one of the things that you're going to need to do is program against Azure Active Directory, Power BI and the Power BI service, and the JavaScript API. So what you're going to see is that app I just showed you, has to have these 3 NuGet packages. The first one, Microsoft Identity Model Clients.Active Directory, that's the Active Directory Authentication Library, what a lot of us call ADL. And then you have Microsoft.PowerBI.API. If you've never seen it before, it was introduced in May with the new embedding features that were announced. And then we have the Microsoft Power BI JavaScript API. That's actually been around before all the changes in May. That's been around for a while. Okay. Now, I've already done a quick demo of the Daily Reporter Pro sample app. So what I'm going to do now is move into the next section on App Workspaces and Premium Capacities. So if we go back earlier than last May, from the time that the Power BI service was introduced until May, it basically gave us 2 licensing options. Users either have free licenses or they have pro licenses. And then everything that we did in Power BI ran in what we call a shared capacity. Now in May, Microsoft made a bunch of announcements and started to introduce Power BI Premium. Now the idea of this licensing model is that customers can create these special things that are called premium capacities, and they can basically store their data and have all their processing happen inside of a dedicated piece of hardware. Now, premium capacities are useful to organizations that have lots of read-only users. They become the way that when you have 20 authors and you have 5,000 casual read-only users, that you get a really good deal with Power BI. Just because you put somebody in a premium capacity, and then basically you do not need to have the pro license for your users to be able to consume things. Okay, now premium capacities are important for this talk because they're used by ISVs to reach users that don't have Power BI licenses nor have Azure Active Directory accounts. Now, I'm not going to give you any pricing. Pricing details are changing. I guess one of the hard things for all of us with Power BI is you can see a blog post by someone who really knows their stuff 4 months ago, and it's no longer correct. Not because the person didn't know the stuff, but just because things are in such constant flux. Now, what we want to look at is App Workspaces. So App Workspaces are used for many different things in the new Power BI model. So if I move over here, and let's go ahead back to Power BI, note that we have different workspaces, and everybody has a personal workspace who has a license. But if you have a pro license, then you're able to create and participate and collaborate in these things that are App Workspaces. Now, if I go take a look at this App Workspace right here, you can see just like a personal workspace, it has data sets, it has reports, dashboards, you can upload Excel workbooks inside there. Okay, and so let's go look at a couple other things. If I go to these workspaces here and I go to my particular workspace and now I say edit workspace, let's go back here. So note that when you create an app workspace, just a quick aside, behind the app workspace today, they're creating Office 365 and SharePoint resources. They create an Office 365 group, and there's also a significant amount of SharePoint provisioning that goes on. So Microsoft and the Power BI team, have stated that they are going to make the creation of app workspaces lighter, so that when you create one, it doesn't create the SharePoint team site elements behind it. But that's still something that we're waiting. But what I want to drill down to here is if I go to this workspace right here, note that when you have a workspace, you can define who the administrators are. And so one thing that you're going to have to make sure is that your particular workspace has the account that you want to use for a master user account. It has to be configured as administrator. Down here under advanced, notice that if your company has purchased premium, you or somebody with more permissions than you will be able to take app workspaces and move them from a shared capacity into a dedicated capacity. And it's that little diamond symbol. When you see the diamond symbol right here, you basically know that that app workspace is running inside of a premium capacity. Okay, if I go to the admin portal for just a second, we have a Power BI MVP's demo environment, and Charles Sterling was silly enough to give some of us permissions, to get to things like the admin portal right here. But if you go to premium settings, note that you can see that you have these things that are called premium capacity or capacity nodes. Now, when we have app workspaces for third-party embedding, I just went through two requirements. The app workspace must be added to a premium capacity, and also the master user account has to be configured as an app workspace admin. So going through this, creating that, and then being able to get at these capacities. Now, as you can see here, if I go back to the admin section, these capacity nodes right here is things that you can buy, and they give you a certain amount of processing power. Now, the premium capacity is a node that is dedicated to a single organization, just your company. If you're not running in a premium capacity, you're running in a node that other organizations are also using, and you can have the noisy neighbor issue where someone else in your capacity just happens to be running a huge job, and then your responsiveness slows down. So by having premium capacities, you basically have a set of hardware in the cloud that is dedicated, just to a single organization. Now, some of the things that we get with the premium capacity is we no longer have the 1 gigabyte upload limitation on PBIX files. We can refresh more than 8 times a day. Each premium capacity defines its own set of admins. So one company might might create 2 capacity nodes and put the mission critical stuff in one, and then basically have another one where they're not so concerned about throwing more and more app workspaces inside there. Okay. Also, premium capacities, once you have them, you're able to share to users without a pro license. One of the big effects of the big changes to the model of licensing that happened in May is that if you are a free user, you used to be able to share dashboards and have dashboards shared with you. That's no longer possible. So if you're a free user, either you're in an island, you can create whatever you want, you just can't show it to anybody, or your company needs to get a premium capacity, which then allows pro users to create content that free users can see. Okay. Now, I'm not going to dwell for very long on this slide right here, but it just kind of shows premium capacity nodes and those that are available. So note there's things like P1, P2, P3, and those go for $5,000 a month, $10,000 a month, $20,000 a month. There's also some EM capacity nodes that are now just coming online. So the difference is if your company is just doing commercial applications and you never need your users to be able to get to the Power BI service through the browser or through a mobile app, you can get away with the EM1. And those start down about $625 a month last time I checked what the cheapest one was. So when you have the P1, P2, and P3, it means you can use Power BI embedding in addition to doing things like targeting free users who already have, Azure AD licenses. Okay, there's a lot there. Adam Saxton, one of my favorite authors, has some great information on premium capacity nodes up in the Power BI documentation. Let's keep moving. So next thing we're going to talk about is authentication with Azure Active Directory. Now, let's start at this high level. So the idea is that if your company uses Office 365 or you use Power BI, you have to have users that have licenses assigned to them, and the only way you can assign a license to one of them is by giving them a user account in Azure Active Directory. So Power BI licenses are assigned to Azure AD user accounts inside. Now, a company owns a tenant, which is basically a directory that has containers of things like users inside of Azure AD. So sometimes you create it for Office 365, and it's called an Office 365 tenant. It's really just an Azure AD tenant that was created with Office 365. Sometimes we start creating a new account just with Power BI, but Azure AD is behind it, and an organization basically is in charge of that particular tenant. Now, a tenant contains user accounts and groups. Let's kind of put some context around this. Let me go back here to Microsoft Azure and the Azure portal. Let's go to Azure Active Directory. Okay, and as I get here and I do something like, let me see all the different users, and groups that we have inside there. It's basically just a big group of users that we have. We can add more users. Okay, that's great. There's also groups. And there's ways to create Office 365 groups like an App Workspace, and there's ways to create lighter weight groups. Okay, now here's the big point. Not only does your tenant have user accounts and groups, it has a registered set of applications. And that basically defines the applications which can authenticate with your Azure AD tenant. So what that means is that if you go down this road and you want to do this type of development, you must learn how to register your applications with Azure AD. It's a requirement if your application is going to call into the Power BI service. Now, when you have applications, they can be registered as web apps or native apps. I'm going to go through that in just a second. Now, when you register an application, and you can do this going through the Azure portal, you can do it with PowerShell, you can do it with C#, you can do it with a special page that the Power BI team made. We'll look at that. But when you create the new application or register the app, Azure AD generates a GUID to identify it, and it's called the client ID. And then the application has to be configured with permissions because you want to call into something like the Power BI Service API. Okay, now if I wanted to create a new Azure AD application, let's go back here. And so back here in Azure AD, let's go ahead and I'll create a new application and new registration. And just to keep things simple, I'll create an application named Bob. Now, most of the time, we're able to create the applications as web apps. There is an unfortunate limitation with Power BI embedding in its form today where we have to register as a native application. Now, what I'm going to do here is to create what's called a redirect URL. Now, when you register as a web application, this matters. When you register as a native application, it really doesn't matter what this is, as long as, the two places you have to supply it, it's the same in both. So let's go ahead and create this app inside here. Now, once I've created this app, let's go ahead and see if we can, find that app inside. Hey, there's the Bob app I just created. And I open it up. You can see it is a native application. Now, apps have permissions. So let's go inside here and notice that there is an application permission for Azure Active Directory that's already assigned. Now, let me go back and cover a couple more slides. So what you've just seen is that I can go down here and I can go ahead and create my app through the Azure portal, right? And I can then configure required permissions. Now, it's also possible for you to go to this one page that the Power BI team created to make it a little bit easier so you don't have to go to the Azure portal inside there. So if you go to app.powerbi.com/apps, you get to a page, and if you authenticate, you can put in the information, click Register App, and it will basically interact with Azure for you. Now, little known fact here. I'm in the Azure portal. You do not need to have an Azure subscription to get to the Azure portal if all you want to do is to play with app registrations. You know, all you need is permissions on that directory inside there. So that's an important point. If I go down here and I say, how many subscriptions do I have? I have no subscriptions. It's not until you want to create something like a virtual machine or a web app that you actually need a subscription. You know, so if you've never tried, go ahead and just try to go to portal.azure.com, and you should be able to do this even without a valid Azure subscription. And that's something that's changed recently. They've opened things up. Now, let's go ahead and get back to this application that I've created right there. So if I go back to apps, and we'll go look for our Bob app, and I'll bring this back up. We have this idea of permissions. Now, with permissions, you have two different types of permissions, application permissions and delegated permissions. So application permissions are those that are given to your application, and to use them, your application has to be able to authenticate without any user, just kind of an app-only authentication. Now, there's also delegated permissions. And the idea of delegated permissions is that they are given to your app, but they require that the current user has the permission. And if the current user has the permission, your app, when running as that user, can use the permission. But they're tightly coupled to a user. Now, one of the other things that will get better over time with the Power BI Service API is today it only has delegated permissions. It doesn't have app level permissions. And I suspect that that will probably change over the next year. So let's go back here. And so here's my app. If I go back to required permissions, and notice that we have some for Azure Active Directory, and we'll say add, and we'd like to go ahead and add something for the Power BI service. So we'll go ahead and choose select. Now, notice that the only thing that we have here is delegated permissions. So there are no application permissions. As a side note, when you register as a native app, not a web app, you couldn't access application permissions anyway. Okay, let's go ahead and choose OK. And let's go ahead and choose done. And so, what you're going to see now is that Power BI Service, I've given it every possible permission, and it has 9 delegated permissions. Now, one other thing I want to point out is that when you have delegated permissions, the first time a user authenticates and tries to use that permission, the user will be forced to consent to this interactive flow. And that's going to be problematic. If you've looked at some of the Adam Saxton articles and you keep seeing him point out, go and click this button, grant permissions, well, that's because there's no interactive flow with the way we're doing third-party embedding. And hopefully that will kind of come out a little bit in a demo I'm going to do in just a few more minutes. Now, we have to talk about different types of authentication flows. So the idea is that you've registered your application with Azure. You now need to go and get an access token. Now, if your application had been configured with application permissions, in order to talk to those, you have to use the client credentials flow. Now, we're not going to be able to use that today, unfortunately, with Power BI embedding. But the idea is you get an app-only authentication based on a very strong public-private key pair SSL certificate. Okay. Now, if you're using first-party embedding, you want to authenticate the current user, so you can use something called the authorization code grant flow. which basically authenticates the user. You get back an authorization code, and then you take the authorization code combined with another client secret, and you basically get an access token. Now, if you're using something like Angular, or you're using React and you have an entire application built with client-side code, you can't really use the authorization code grant flow because it requires keeping secrets. And if everything is pushed back to the client, you have to kind of assume that the bad guy can get at any data that you pass back there. So we refer to that as a public client, and there's a way to get the access token passed back through the browser. Okay. Now, the last one is unfortunately the one that we have to use for Power BI embedding, which is user credentials flow. So it's going to be used in native clients, and the idea is it requires passing the username and password across the network. Now, you've seen me register that application with Azure AD already. So in just a second, we'll take advantage of that application. Now, just to kind of recap, if you are using first-party embedding, the authentication flows that you can use is either the authorization code grant flow or the implicit flow. Okay, third-party embedding is going to force us to use something called direct user credentials against the master user account. And the real rub here is that we are authenticating against a user, but we want to do it in such a way that many of us refer to as unattended execution. We can't have any type of interactivity required where the user has to enter a password or click a consent button. However, Azure Active Directory, isn't really built for this, which kind of creates a rub inside there. Okay, now, back to our demo. So what you're going to see is that inside here, inside of models, we have this C# class, the PBI embedded manager inside there. So what we have here is a class that takes on the responsibilities of getting access tokens from Azure AD, retrieving and embedding data, or retrieving whatever embedded resource data we need from Power BI, and then passing that embedded data to the browser using MVC View Models. Now, if you look at the data required, well, you're going to have a client ID for the application you registered. You need the App Workspace ID. The little trick there is if I go back here and now I move to my App Workspace right here, note that up in the browser, you can go ahead and grab that, and that is, basically the App Workspace ID. But now here's the rub. You are putting, in demo code, putting your username and your password, right into your app settings in your web.config file. Another problem is if someone gets the username and password, they can call in, and basically act as you and call in the service. And because we've registered as a native app, there's no protection from the reply URL as if we had registered as a web app inside there. Okay, so that's the bad part. Let's dwell on the good parts now. So let's say that now, our application, there are a couple constants here that we need when we program against Azure AD, and what you'll see is that this first one is the endpoint. That's where we go to start the authentication process. When you get an access token, there has to be some identifier that says what is the resource that you want the token for. So basically that's what analysiswindowservers.net is. And then finally, when you call into the API, there's got to be some type of a route there. Now also, we're going to pull in that other information. Okay, now here's the code we're going to use right here. We're going to create an Azure AD authentication context. And then when you're using third-party embedding, you've got that master user account. Best practice would be create a user account not associated with a human being, just a daemon account. Make sure it has a Power BI Pro license, and make sure that whatever app workspace you're targeting, that user account has been configured as an admin. Okay, so then you could say user password credentials, and you can go ahead and get the access token. Okay, now that you've seen that, let's go ahead and do a very simple programming example against the Power BI Service API. So what I have let's go ahead and move over to this sample application right here. So we'll go ahead and stop Power BI embedding demo. I'll move over to this Hello Power BI Service API. So what I wanted to do is create a very simple console application. And what you'll see is that it's a C# console application, and it has the Azure Active Directory Library package. And then I've also added the Power BI Service API NuGet package. And note, when you add the Power BI Service API NuGet package, it adds two other packages, Microsoft.rest.client runtime and Newtonsoft.json, because of the dependencies that the NuGet package for the Power BI Service API has on those two other packages. Okay, you don't program against those two other packages, but the code, inside of the Power BI Service API .NET layer does. Okay, now what you'll see here, let me go ahead and if I do the little Shift Alt J or Control Alt J, and we bring up the browser in here, note that it's a .NET client, so you can kind of look at these things inside here. So here's just an example of the Microsoft Power BI API v2. So what am I going to use? I'm going to use something such as this reports object down here. Okay, and then also we're going to see that there's this important one, which is the Power BI client. Now notice that there is another namespace that has models. So whenever they need to serialize data, move back and forth, generally they have a model to create that. Okay, now if I just want to do hello world, you can see that this code is fairly simple inside here. In fact, instead of just looking at that code, let's go back here and just kind of see the actual application. So the only thing I really care about here, is getting the client ID. So let's go back. Let's go back to my Bob application, and there is the client ID. Note that sometimes we call the client ID the application ID. As a developer, you're supposed to know that. Let's go back here. Go ahead and put the application ID, aka client ID, inside there. We have no redirect URL inside there. Okay, so now that we've got that, note that here I'm going to have this get access token method. Now this is going to be a little bit different than the code inside of our sample application. What this is going to say is, even though I'm connecting from a native client, I'm going to pass this parameter that says, oh, by the way, if we need to interact with the user, go ahead and do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this right here. So I go ahead and run it. It's going to say, first of all, log in, Ted. And as I log in and go ahead, all of a sudden I get hit with this page. So every user who is going to use delegated permissions is going to be, interactively prompted to basically accept these permissions inside here. So one of the issues is when you have a non-interactive session, you can't do that. So when you go back and you kind of see, why does the, Adams article tell me to go to permissions and then to basically take whatever permissions that they are inside here and basically click on the grant button? It's because we're not going to go through that interactive login inside there. So once again, just kind of a unfortunate problem, but that's how to get around it. Now, once we've got that inside there, let's go ahead and run this one more time, except this time I want to add one extra thing, and that is I want to bring up the Fiddler utility. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and run our simple application one more time. Note that this time, since that user already consented, that consent screen won't come up this time. It just came up the first time you run that inside there. We'll go ahead and we will run this. And as we run it inside here, here's an example of a call that goes out across. One thing to point out is, look at this URL. Even though our DLL has v2, it's still making calls into the service, under a v1.0. So what's a little bit confusing is the Power BI service hasn't really versioned. It's the DLL has gotten bigger and covered more of the new things they put into it. That's the way I would look at it. But what you can see here is if I go back and look at this code right here, and first of all, we create this thing which is called a Power BI client. Now, when I create a Power BI client, I've got the access token, and then this is a class that is inside of the Power or the REST assembly that's added as a dependency. And the idea is that then you create a Power BI client, and you basically tell it where to call into, and then you basically give it a access token. Okay, and then once we've created the Power BI client, we can do things such as this inside here. Dot reports. So you have a reports object, and you have a get reports. And the idea is that calling get reports will get all the reports that you have inside of your personal workspace. If I now call something like get reports in group, that basically says get all the reports in a particular app workspace, and you have to pass the GUID for the app workspace inside there. Okay, so what you'll find is anything without the in group is generally your personal workspace. Anything that is inside of an app workspace has the in group inside there. And because third-party embedding, we're never using personal workspaces, you'll see in group in just about everything you call inside there. Now, you can also see that when you called that, what does it look like, coming over the network? And what you can see here is that, here is all the data that comes back about these different reports that we have inside there, including things like the GUID of the report and things like the embed URL. Okay, so now that we've seen that, let's go ahead and close some of this down. Let's go back to our other application, and I think we've got about another 13 minutes, which hopefully should be enough time to go through the other pieces. Okay, now in this application, this demo application, we're using MVC. So we build things using MVC controllers, and the idea is that an MVC controller is able to either call across the network, or better yet, call another class that has the responsibility of calling across the network. And the idea is that the controller is going to call to our PBI embedding manager object and call some particular method, and that method is going to return something that we're going to refer to as a view model. And the idea is that once you pass the view model to a view in MVC, well, now we have this way that we can say at model and refer to the workspace name, the workspace ID inside there. So what gets to be an important practice is defining what is the data that you want to get to your views. So one of the things we do is we create classes to be a view model. So let's look at, for my home page, for example. I go back here, and I'm just going to start up the application. And what we need to do is we need to get information for the home page of the application itself. So here, what I want to do on the home page is just kind of show you that we can talk to the Power BI service. So I want to get the app workspace name, the app workspace ID, and figure out who the master user account is that's running inside here. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to define a class called home view model, and we're going to add the data we need to get out to the client. Next, we're going to define a method, get home view model, that actually does the work across the network inside there. And the idea is that get home view model lives in that PBI embedding manager class, and that's the one that does the work of calling to the Power BI service across the network, getting back data, filling a view model, passing it back to a controller who can then basically pass it along to the view. Now, inside of our application, we want to have other views for things like the reports view model. So here, as I go over to this page right here, we need to have some view model that's going to bring back things like the different reports, so I can add those inside there. Now, let me once again pull up Fiddler. And as I pull up Fiddler, and let's go ahead and run this one more time. And the idea is we need to get information about various things. So here are two calls that just went across the network inside here. Now, if I step back here to the PBI Embedding Manager class, let me go ahead and look at one of these methods. So for instance, I want to get the reports view model. So here's just an example of client reports, get reports in group async. So we're basically using asynchronous calls across the network to improve threading and throughput support. But the idea is that once you get these back, you can start building your view model inside there. Okay. If I look at, what we're pulling back with these calls, let's go ahead and just kind of look at the JSON, and you can see that for reports, you get things like the GUID of the report, and you get something very special called the embed URL. Now, if I want to create a new report, for instance, here, I can bring up a report. That's kind of neat. But also, if I click on New, it's going to show me all the different data sets. And if you want to create a new report, let's go ahead and click on this right here. I want to create a new report based on this data set. Well, then you need to basically have information about the data set you want to build a new report on. There's no information about a new report until you create it. Okay. So now you've seen that. Let's keep going through. And let's talk about working with embeddable resources. Now, there are three different things that you can embed inside. So you can embed reports. Let's go back here. And the idea is if you embed a report and that report provides interactivity to the user, well, your application just basically showing an iframe, and that report has all the interactivity that it has when accessed through the Power BI service in the browser. Okay. Now also note that you can bring a report into edit mode. So let's say that I take this inside here, I make this a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, I make some kind of a change inside here. Let's make some type of a nebulous change inside. I go to items and I change it to a different color. Let's go ahead and save that. Okay, and now let's go ahead and move to a different report. Let's go back and move back to that report. And what you can see is, hey, my color's stuck. In fact, if we go back here, just through the Power BI service in the browser, and we open up that same report inside here, what we can see here, let me get to this App Workspace, let me get to reports, let me open that back up. So we've changed the underlying report. So the ability to either, edit existing reports or create new reports and provide that to your users, that is something that was just introduced in May. Okay, now you also have dashboards. And the idea of dashboard embedding, let's go back here. Let's go back to dashboards, is that you're able to embed a dashboard. Brings back the dashboards I have. And when you embed dashboards, you get some interactivity. For instance, if I hover over this, I can see that. But unlike using the dashboard through the browser, where if you click on a tile, you navigate to the report, that doesn't happen. So you don't get the same level of interactivity, with dashboards. But some of the good news is that if you're using real-time dashboards, you can embed those, and those work just fine. Now, you can also get down to the granularity of embedding a tile from a dashboard without having to embed the entire dashboard. So if you only want to allow, selected tiles, or you wanted some behavior when someone clicked on a tile to be able to navigate to some special location, being able to embed the tiles gives you the ability to do that. Now, as far as, let's look at a report. When I want to embed a report, well, I'm going to need to know what is the GUID of that report, and you also need to know the embed URL. Now, before we get to the client side, there's one more thing that we need to do on the server side, and that's generate the embed token. Now, think about it like this. You can embed reports using the regular Azure Active Directory access token of the master user account. But you shouldn't for a couple different reasons. One is if you embed a report with that token, the user has the token, can take it. People refer to access tokens as cash because they're a resource that once you have, you can use to do whatever you want with. So you might want to create a more restricted token. Another big reason to use embed tokens is you might want to stay within the bounds of Power BI licensing terms. So if you use the user token for the master user account and you make your app accessible to 1,000 non-licensed users, that is a licensing violation. However, if you are working in an environment where you have Power BI but you don't have Power BI Premium and you can't create a premium capacity, you cannot create embed tokens. So by using the master user token, you can do testing. Okay, now here's some code. And what you see is that there is a generate token request object in the .NET API. And when you create a token request, you get to specify an access level of edit or view. And then what's going to happen is you're going to say client reports generate token. Now, a couple details about these tokens. The embed token provides restrictions on what the user can see and whether the user can just view or the user can edit. The embed token is created for one specific resource. So if you create an access token for report 1, you cannot use it with report 2. The embed token can only be generated when you are inside of a Power BI premium capacity. Okay. Last thing, someone reached out to me yesterday and asked me a question. So I added this to kind of answer it. So back in Power BI embedded version 1 in Azure, they had support for row level security. So we're about to get the same support. So they basically told us that the support is coming in August, and it is August. So the idea in both the old API and what's coming for the new API is when you generate a embed token, you're going to be able to pass a string that matches one of the roles that you've defined in your PBIX file. Now, until that support is added and they allow us to pass a string, it's a little bit of a hacky workaround. So Microsoft says, sure, you can create 5 different master user accounts and then use your role level security, for those, but obviously that's another $10 per month just for every role that you want to use. So Microsoft's, coming up with the real solution that, as I mentioned, we should see a blog entry announcing this hopefully over the next couple days or weeks. Now, the last thing we need to do over on the server is get the information we need for the embed configuration, which is going to be the embed token, it's going to be the embed URL, and it's going to be the report ID. And so what you see is in the report view model, we have both a report object and the embed configuration object inside there. Okay, and that takes us to the very last piece right here, which is what we do on the client side, embedding with the Power BI JavaScript API. Now, what you'll see in this project right here, let me go ahead, close this, move back over here, and if I now come back over here, notice that I have an app.ts file. Now, you can do the programming on the client with either JavaScript or TypeScript. TypeScript's a little rough these days because we're still trying to get the type information to do strongly typed JavaScript correct. So what you'll see is that my application is a little bit fudgy. Just to be able to program with TypeScript, I've added things like the page collection inside here. But the idea is that working with TypeScript instead of JavaScript is now we can start putting the type names and get compile time type checking and get a much better IntelliSense when we program against these things inside there. So there is this TypeScript class that I've created, Power BI Embedding Manager Client. Now, if we then look at the views, let's look at the view for the report. And so if I go all the way down to the bottom, what you'll see here is that I can get the information about the embed config, into the page that's being passed back. And so if we then, take this simple low-tech route of taking the pieces of data I need and putting them in a script tag, and then making a call, into my TypeScript code inside there, it's going to basically fire up, this method right here. Now, here is this method that's going to be called when things are loaded inside there. Once again, let's go back here and let's kind of do this from scratch. And what I mean from scratch is, let's go ahead and click on this right here. And so that's going to have a page that's retrieved, but now what you'll see is that there is a report ID in the URL. So what's going to happen is it's going to pass back a view model that says there is a current report to load inside there. And basically, it then calls this particular method inside. Now, what's going to happen is we're going to create this JavaScript object, which is the config object. And then I'm going to say type equals report versus type equals dashboard. I'm going to put different things inside there, such as the access token. And notice that there is a token type, and this can either be set to Embed Token or Azure AD Access Token. So when you're using third-party embedding, it's going to be an Embed Token. Now, let's go ahead and as you click on this, you're going to create this object. So here, I'm going to say Power BI Embed, and I'm going to pass that report container. So basically, this is just the HTML element where I want to insert the iframe, and here's my config object. Now, one comment I have to make is that a year and a half ago when I started doing this, we didn't have this fancy JavaScript API. So now I can sound like one of those old bitter guys who walked, to school uphill both ways. Now you have something that just basically takes the iframe, creates it behind the scenes, and the whole business of taking the access token and stuffing it inside the iframe, which is pretty grungy code, has now been abstracted away from us completely. Now, not only are you able to create the iframe, but now you have this JavaScript object, which now we can start hooking up event handlers to. So now you have to kind of think about this. I'm writing some client-side JavaScript or TypeScript here. Inside of this iframe, you basically have a report that's loaded in. And this idea of a report object is a proxy that you can use to communicate with that particular object. So for instance, what happens after the report loads? So right here, what you can see is we create the iframe, and what's going to happen is nothing until it finishes loading. When it finishes loading, well, now I can run some code that responds, and I can say report get pages. And now I have a little thing called load pages down here. And so what load pages is going to do, I'll kind of just briefly describe it, is that it looks at the report, figures out the pages. So what's kind of neat about this is if you don't like the navigation scheme that's built into a report, you can turn off the built-in page navigation, and in your JavaScript, that sits beside your embedded report, you can create whatever custom navigation scheme that you want. Okay. And some of the other things you'll see inside this is, things like we want the ability to go into edit mode. I like to be able to click on edit and go into edit mode, so now my user can, make changes inside here, and be able to save those changes. Okay. And so you can see that that JavaScript object just has a switch mode into edit or view. So I can simply, switch back and forth, between edit mode and view mode. Okay. Likewise, there are things that you can do to go into full screen, as well, if that's something that, you're interested, in being able to do inside there. Okay. Now, how about a new report? If I want to create a new report here, what you can see is it then introduces this dialog, and it shows me the different data sets that are inside there. Okay. Now, back here, let me go back and close this, and let's look at create report. So the idea is that if we need to create a report, we need to know what data set, what is the embed URL, So that's not different. It's the same no matter what report it is. You need the access token and what type of token inside there. So the idea is if I come back here and I click on this and it runs that piece of code you just saw, well, now I have a brand new report. Okay, let's go ahead and do something inside there. For instance, let's take sales revenue and, we'll do something really simple. I know lots of people hate pie charts, so let's torture them by creating a pie chart inside here. Okay, but the idea is I've got this particular chart inside here. I'll go ahead and I'll do a save as command, and I'll save that, as Bob inside here, and I'll go ahead and choose OK. Now, once I've done that, there's a kind of a strange programming thing that you have to do, because you have a new report loaded in, but then you can see that there is a save as command. So when save is triggered, what we're going to do is we're going to take that new report that was just created, and we're going to basically load it in like we've loaded in other reports inside there. But all of a sudden now you can see that that's a new report we've just captured. Okay. So hopefully this one application can kind of get you started. So, I really kind of encourage everyone to go back and take a look at this Daily Reporter Pro, follow along the code inside there, and see if you can get up and running inside there. Okay. So I hope that was a full hour for us. We've gone a little bit over. I apologize for that. A quick plug for my company, Critical Path Training. We specialize in Power BI training on the high technical end. We have a Power BI boot camp for advanced users, for data analysts, for system integrators, drills down on Power BI desktop development, works with workspaces. It works with distributed apps, things like that. We've added some coverage of Power Apps and Microsoft Flow. And then we also have a developer bootcamp, which is really more about Visual Studio and Node.js type of development, custom visuals, R programming, type of material that we've covered here. So go ahead and check out these if you'd like. Other than that, I would like to thank everybody for attending inside there. And once again, this will be recorded, and anyone who registered this will receive a follow-up email sometime today or early tomorrow telling you, how to access that recording. So thanks very much for attending, and I really appreciate everyone's excitement about the Power BI platform. Thanks again.